Hi, welcome back. This is Formative Assessment podcast number 8. It's going to be about curriculum for learning. In the last podcast, which was the last of the Shirley Clark podcast and the classroom practice podcast, we looked at the structure of the lesson, and we talked about how it's really difficult, now impossible, to talk about a lesson in isolation. And what you need to do is think about the lesson as part of a larger whole, or a larger number of larger wholes. And that inevitably leads us to think about what those larger wholes are, and that leads us to curriculum. So curriculum is a very large topic right now, and there's a lot to say. So I'm just going to fixate on one document that Dylan Wiliam wrote in 2013, which I'm going to send along to my colleagues for the SSAT, Principal Curriculum Design. And what you'll start to hear in Dylan Wiliam's thought is a lot of the things that Ofsted has echoed and interpreted. And so I thought going back to this document would help you think about curriculum in an empowered and positive way, as opposed to something that makes you feel de-skilled. So to start, here's my starter. So what are we doing today? You go into a classroom. I saw a bunch of lessons last year, and here are some things that sometimes you could hear. We're doing the 8-mark question today. We're preparing for the exam. We're comparing good and bad answers to paper 2, question 4. We're improving AL1 and AL2, or we're doing English today. So what these kind of podcasts, this seminar in a way, has asked us to think about is a few areas that we could already query. When you come into a classroom and the teacher or the student say, this is what we're working on, it's worth thinking about what's actually the learning culture here. What thought and what values are prompted by these statements? What are the learning intentions? What exactly is being learned today? And how does the student know? And finally, talk culture. How do the teacher and student articulate the learning? If I'm utterly baffled by the 8-mark question. What is the 8-mark question? What is it that we're actually doing? And how does the teacher articulate that? And then how does the student articulate that? English isn't an adequate response. It shows really clearly that the teacher doesn't know exactly the focus, and as a result, the student won't. Now, don't get me wrong, we all have days where we say these things, or we're just for the moment of efficiency, but again, we're trying to strive towards best practice and think about what kind of values, what kind of structure are we giving to our lesson. And what we should be thinking about, what we talked about in the last podcast, is that idea of structure. Now I want to really marry that idea of structure with the curriculum. How does what we're doing today fit into something bigger? How does what is being done, or the performance in the lesson, match up with the learning? And part of that's going to be, the bigger issue there is exam performance versus curriculum. Okay, and those are some of the things I'm gonna. So the words in the ideas in blue are the ones that you should be ready to say something about now, because you've done all these podcasts. The in green is where we're going next. So just to remind you, we talked about these nests of structure, the key stage, the year, the term. We talked about, and then about the scheme of work, and then the week being a unit of time. Sorry, the 2-week unit of time for feedback, the 1-week unit of time, and then the individual lesson. The individual lesson being the most atomic, the smallest particle, if you will, of the learning, and it lifts all the way up from the term into the year, into the key stage, and then beyond into the curriculum as a whole. So this is what we mean by structure. This is what we mean by curriculum. So as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at Dylan Wiliam's Principal Curriculum Design of 2013. We're going to look at this idea of curriculum versus exam performance. Since it's Dylan Wiliam, you've got to know he's going to say something about pedagogy in his comment, which I would echo. Pedagogy trumps curriculum. We're going to talk about the relevance, how actually, sometimes Dylan Wiliam's work can be really, it's quite broad, and there are some quite conservative people, I think, who hijack or kind of inflect his work with a more traditional, and, he says some radically conservative things sometimes. But actually, I think if you look at this document, he says some really interesting things that are not as conservative as you might think about the need for relevance and balance in the curriculum. Then we're going to move to this idea of the disciplinary knowledge, like to make sure that he calls this idea of rigorous and coherent. And part of that is the idea of big ideas. And then we're going to come back to this notion of progression versus sequencing, which I think is really crucial, particularly for the way Ofsted's talking right now. Okay, so Wiliam begins this essay by talking about four reasons why we educate. And, he says the first one, probably best exemplified by Paulo Freire, is we educate for personal empowerment and control of our lives. Another reason we educate is for cultural transmission, to understand what has come before us, around us. He quotes Matthew Arnold, the best that has been thought, or I've lost it. I lost the exact phrasing. Ofsted uses the exact one. Matthew Arnold's phrase is a quite contested one. What culture is transmitted, whose culture, who's speaking, is worth thinking about. But nonetheless, I think the idea of cultural transmission is still there. Preparation for citizenship and preparation for work. All of these are reasons to educate. They are sometimes in conflict, he notes, but there are some of the reasons that we could think about what's underpinning what we're doing. I would add, in blue, what we can't do, even though much of society wants us to do, is we, teaching, cannot take responsibility for the causes or the solutions to social and economic inequality. I reject that completely. And it's important why I reject that is because it's something placed upon teachers all the time. That, and you see it in this coronavirus too, that whether lionized or demonized, teachers are given a lot of responsibility, seemingly. Schools are given a lot of responsibility in rebalancing the stakes in an already unequal system. And I don't really think that that's a realistic thing to place on us. But on the other hand, I do think we should say what are the things that we can do. And for me, and what these podcasts are about, is about having professional pride and identity in what we do, have a passion and love for learning, to know our subject really well, and to know how to teach our subject really well. And again, to borrow William's phrase, we improve our teaching, and we improve our curriculum, and we improve everything we do, not because we aren't good enough, but because we can always become better. Because that the growth mindset concept shouldn't only be applied to students. That actually it's more relevant to teachers. We should have this growth mindset, exemplify it to move on. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the curriculum versus the exam. Okay. So what is the curriculum? The knowledge, the skills, the vocabulary, the history, the cultural impact, kind of the historical, cultural import of your subject, the habits of mind, so the disciplinary apparatus. What I mean by that sounds really fancy, but what I mean by that is, what does it mean to think in your subject? And how does it mean to think differently as a geographer, a sociologist, a scientist, a visual artist, an athlete? These are the things that constitute your subject's curriculum, and particularly the habits of thought. That might be the one to really help you conceptualize. Okay, what am I doing that's different than the people down the hallway? And that essentially is the curriculum. So the curriculum, and this big blue square is the curriculum. It is the widest domain possible to encompass the core values of your subject area. Okay? And this is crucially different from exam performance. This is everything involved in your subject, not what the exam board determines. We have, to a great deal, taught a smaller domain, and for very particular reasons, which I'm going to get into in a moment. And this return to curriculum is crucial, and I would argue, I definitely think it's ethically correct and educationally correct. But it's not something we're just doing because Ofsted's coming. We're doing because we need to rethink this idea about learning versus the exam. But I'm very annoyed by the way Ofsted has articulated, and I find it very Orwellian, because now they're trying to scrutinize curriculum, having for years scrutinized internal data tracking, progress, and now they flipped it and very conveniently, I would add, this idea that good results are evidence of a good curriculum. So curriculum, understandably, for many people, starts to feel like yet another stick to be beaten with. And I would say take out the Ofsted because they don't really understand what they're doing or what their purpose is. And they speak out of both sides of their mouth, but think again about what you understand to be the curriculum. Okay? So here we have the curriculum, the widest domain of knowledge and the disciplinary habits of mind that we've already explored. There is the sample. That sample is the exam. Okay, so the exam samples the wider domain of knowledge. And if, this is Daisy Christodoulou who argues this, which is quite well put, if the mastery of the entire domain of the curriculum is our focus, then exams are valid measures of that goal. Okay, but what happens is, what we do is we have taught to the exam. And what that's doing is that essentially destroys the validity of the exam. Because instead of sampling the entire domain of what we're teaching, we are teaching that exam terrain. And this is important because I've been here. I've been teaching for 10 years in a high stakes, high accountability system where I totally know why that's happened, because there are so many implications and penalties for not getting good results. And these have created perverse incentives to teach directly to the exam. And, you know, she can say this, which is absolutely true. The moment we start to target the exam, then the exam is not a valid measure. Tests are not direct measures of the domain, only samples. Teaching to the test is therefore a major threat to the validity of most inferences we want to make. We want to understand what students have and haven't learned. If we teach only to the exam, it doesn't work. So Ofsted now is woken up to that, or at least they borrowed this rhetoric without, you know, in a total audacious cultural amnesia about what the past 10 or 15 years has been about, which is about judging schools based on, and still to a large extent, Progress 8, 9 to 4s, 9 to 5s, progress for vulnerable groups. Exam performance is still to a large extent what we are judged on. And if that's the case, it's always going to undermine what we're doing. It's going to make these perverse incentives to teach the exam. So the exam essentially becomes the curriculum. And again, I say this has become, we've been undermined in our professional knowledge, in our professional judgment through Ofsted. We're in a competitive field with our colleagues through league tables, and there's always the fear of privatization, i.e. our school being taken away from the local authority into an academy or an academy chain. So as a result, we've been stimulated or perversely incentivized to go towards teaching of the test. And now Ofsted says they want to look at the curriculum, but look, we see this tension, okay? Now, just because that tension is there, and just because results are important, it's important that students achieve as much as they possibly can, there's been a real tension of understanding and comprehension here that I think is worth thinking about. Okay, so what we need to think about, I think, what we should be responsible or be able to articulate at least is, what is our curriculum vision and what are its aims? So here for me is English. So English is an education of the imagination through the study and analysis of literary texts alongside the analysis and recreation of expository nonfiction writing. Now, this was a vision that we've really enacted this year. It's required inherently a reconceptualization of Key Stage 3. And in yellow is the exam, okay? Is the GCSE exam anyway, which is a sample of that larger thing. And that exam is a subset. It involves speaking, reading, and writing. It involves prose, poetry, and drama, creation and analysis, seen and unseen. So what I want us in English, and what I want all of our subjects to be able to kind of do is rediscover, reappropriate that which is our vision as a larger domain, and the exam as a subset of that domain. Okay, moving back to Dylan Wiliam. He said with the creation of a national curriculum, he said a lot of people in schools thought, okay, well, that is the curriculum, because And he said there was a real lack of understanding there because all the national curriculum is a legal requirement. What he calls, and I think is a really great, the real curriculum is the lived daily experience of young people in classrooms, and really quite empowering, is created by teachers every day. That is actually what's going on in the classroom, is what is the actual curriculum. And he argues that curriculum development in this document, really great document, it's a planned and collegial thing. It's not just something inherited and given to you. It builds on the expertise of others on your team, in the world, and scholarship, in your subject. And every school's curriculum has to be, by definition, unique. So it's this big problem of being told what a good curriculum, or how your curriculum isn't adequate enough. Whereas, again, Ofsted, whereas the model for it hasn't been articulated, which I find utterly abhorrent, actually. But for me, it's more empowering to think, okay, well, every school, what we do every day is the actual lived real curriculum. And what we need to think about is making that the best it can possibly be. And let's try and explore that. So, early on, as I said, these podcasts have invited me to think about my own practice and my early practice. I remember when I was had no idea what to do in a lesson, had no idea what a scheme of work is, had no idea what the curriculum was really. You go in TS and you download lessons, or a colleague purchased or got the free version of lessons from and there are a lot of places you can do this. Teach It, TES, Pixel now provides an amount of resources that could drown your mind. Again, you have the ARC Mastery, a very high premium priced product. These are all ways to fill a gap. I don't know what I'm doing. Here's a quick fix. Well, the thing is, there is no quick fix, really. Dylan Wiliam argues there is never going to be a step-by-step model for curriculum development. It's just like teaching. It's just too complex to be solved with a recipe. You can't purchase something. You can't just do X, Y, and Z and have a curriculum. This, like everything we've been talking about in these podcasts, is complex. I'm sorry that, for some people, the academic nature of it, the theoretical nature of it is alienating, but I think it's really important to dig into these issues, because to get into the complexity, to simplify that complexity and to engage in it is going to help you be empowered to understand what it is that you want to make and how to make it, is what I'd argue. And I think it's really important to say, you can't just, it's not off the shelf. It's not off the shelf. So, he argues in this document that learning activities have to be designed backwards. So you kind of figure out what you want, and then you figure out how to do it. Because, and this is him in the blue, anyone can stand in front of a class and tell the students what they need to know. It's just that most students won't learn very effectively from that kind of teaching. And then he says quite cheekily, although it's important to note that some certainly will. Some people, I think it's really important to know that some students do actually learn from lecturing and direct instruction in that kind of didactic way. And by the way, maybe a lot more than you may realize, and for some topics other than others. But you can't just lecture. That isn't teaching. You have to actually teach. And to teach, you got to know where you're going, and you got to plan it out carefully. You can't just stumble across it. So this is actually why a curriculum is really important, and why thinking about kind of milestones and learning intentions and success criteria are really crucial, because the better idea you have of where you're going and how you're going to get there, the clearer your teaching will be. He goes on to argue the challenge really is translating this intention into learning. So again, this is him in the green. And anyone can think up interesting and engaging activities that will occupy students in classrooms. But unfortunately, such activities do not always or even often result in valued learning for students. This is a really harsh pill, like a lot of fun stuff. The kids look really excited and happy. Are they actually learning anything? He says the challenge, and look at this paragraph really carefully, translating the intended curriculum into the achieved curriculum is to engage students in interesting activities that nevertheless result in valued learning for students. The warning is the nevertheless. Engagement isn't learning. What is learning? Well, that's something we're going to have to think about in terms of assessment. We've been talking about that in terms of formative assessment. In the next podcast, we're going to try to consolidate our understanding of assessment. But this is a problem in that engagement, excitement in the class isn't necessarily learning. So lecturing isn't learning, though it will be for some. And engagement and just a bunch of stuff you do isn't actually necessarily learning. So how are we supposed to get the learning to happen? Well, of course, it's pedagogy, because it's that we're constantly assessing and adapting to student needs is how we, the teacher, are going to make sure that we know the students are actually having valuable learning. So from there, he says quite brazenly, but I think quite accurately, that pedagogy trumps curriculum. And right away, you can know that he's right, because just because you have the best curriculum, okay, on paper, or the department has designed it, or maybe a colleague has given something to you, or you've been working on something collaboratively using all these principles, and it's amazing, but it's badly taught, that is going to be much worse for young people than a bad intended curriculum well taught. And that is a really funny, interesting paradox. And right away, then you should take his brazen provocation. Pedagogy trumps curriculum. Once again, the number one thing we can do as a community to improve the learning and the engagement of all our students is to improve our teaching. And the work we should do on curriculum is very crucial. This whole podcast is about it, but teaching is above that. The real curriculum, the enacted or achieved curriculum, since that's the daily lived experience of young people, curriculum is pedagogy. Since what we're teaching is the real curriculum, he wittily does a kind of shell game there, that is actually the curriculum. So once again, what's on paper might be a bit of a trick. And then this is the empowering part for me anyway. Teachers create and develop curriculum every day whenever they plan and deliver lessons. So curriculum isn't this magical kind of macro thing that exists in the sky above us. It is the lived experience of every day. And the process of improving our curriculum, that wider domain knowledge, is something that maybe we need to do when we're away from the hurly-burly and grind of the classroom. But remember, that grind to the classroom, that culture that you're doing every day, that is the real curriculum. And that's really important to think about, because that's why pedagogy is so crucial. And the relationship between pedagogy and curriculum is I think, what he's getting at in this document. So now let's look at what is meant by this. What should this principled curriculum look like? Okay. So he's really fond, I brought it up in an earlier podcast, of this quote from Ausubel from 1968. If I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this: the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach him accordingly. I think this is a very powerful phrase. I think it's something to think about a lot. Look, there is no master teacher outside of a context. You can't just imagine there are these amazing, perfect teachers in the world. Teachers are in context. The students are part of that context, who they are, what do they actually know, and knowing that, the teacher can then respond. I think about that. That is powerful. So actually teaching, in a way, begins with the student. And I think that what William's been arguing, what I've been trying to argue in these podcasts, is it's this constant dialogue and to actually have that dialogic teaching, you have to start with the student. Okay, well, let's go a little bit further then. He quotes someone called Hilda Taba, and it goes further. It is necessary to know something about students' cultural backgrounds, motivational patterns, and the content of their social learning, such as the particular meanings they bring to school, their particular approach to learning tasks, and the expectations they have on themselves and of others. So actually, the culture and context of your school is crucial to your curriculum, because you have to understand who these people are that you're teaching. The community, the language, the culture, where they're from, how they learn, what their interests are. All of this is crucial to the curriculum. Content, he thus notes, is more than knowledge. Okay, it is knowledge of facts, ideas, and concepts, but it's also the thought process, the values and attitudes, sensitivities and feelings. Wow, you don't think this is going to come out of Dylan Wiliam, but it's there. That actually we have to know where our students are from, how they feel, how they think, how they experience, if we're going to teach effectively. And that is part of the curriculum. Because as a creative act, we make what we teach as vital to the actual, not the ideal student. We aren't teaching some imaginary perfect students. Look, when we're stressed out, we blame everything on the students. If only the students were like, some imaginary perfect version of yourself, maybe, but they're not. They are young people, and they are young people from a variety of different backgrounds. And particularly in my context, in inner city, in inner London, the economic, social, and emotional challenges, particularly now post coronavirus, it's going to be really unbelievable to think about the return. That's the actual situation, and you can't just imagine there's a greater kind of fantastical thing that teaching is aiming at. We begin with what's in the room. Or what does Stuart Lee say? You with stand-up comedy, you play the room. You don't complain about the audience. Whatever the room is, that's who you work to. And at the end of his document, he talks about relevance, and he says, look, all this thing he has talked about means little if the curriculum isn't relevant to the students. And this is why teacher creativity is so important. And again, pedagogy, because what we're doing, he says, is creating situational interest. What is situational interest? The extraordinary way that good teachers get students interested in things they never knew they were interested in. It simply is inadequate to presume a culture of low expectations that students will not be interested in X, Y, and Z because it isn't part of their cultural heritage or something that they're familiar with or should know. It's our job to create situational interest. It is one of the greatest creative acts of our job, of our profession, to facilitate and find ways of making kids interested. Okay, so that's really I think that's a really powerful part of what he's arguing. From here, early on in the document, he says, okay, well, in addition, learning should be balanced. It should be a large exploration, not a narrow path. And he quotes these two. I'm just going to share them with you. We need to produce people who know how to act when they're faced with situations for which they were not specifically prepared. The test of successful education is not the amounts of knowledge that a pupil takes away from school, but his appetite to know and his capacity to learn. This suggests, Dylan Wiliam adds, that every school's curriculum should promote the intellectual, moral, spiritual, aesthetic, creative, emotional, and physical development of the child. The traditional disciplines of language, arts, mathematics, science, history, geography should, of course, figure strongly, but the subjects that are sometimes called the creative arts, dance, drama, music, art, are just as important. And again, I think this takes us to that domain versus the exam performance. We have seen in schools, in cultures where the high stakes nature of testing has dominated, that some subjects get priorities and the entire focus of the school is on those subjects. And that's inadequate. And, we could say also the baccalaureate is, with its absence of creative subjects, is completely inadequate. And that actually part of the moral and ethical job of a school presenting a fair curriculum is to expose the students to as large a domain of knowledge within the subject, but also within all the subjects. And I think it's really powerful and important to say are just as important. And we need to think about this large exploration and the school offering that large exploration of possibility. Okay, so we've talked about learning versus exam performance, pedagogy and pedagogy trumping curriculum, how we need to be relevant and balanced. Now let's talk about the disciplinary knowledge of curriculum. And let's begin. This took me a long time to get my head around, and then all of a sudden when I was doing this, I kind of understood. So let me ask a question. Is the concept of an upside down triangle a conceptual, definitional error, or is it just a misconception, or is it something else? Okay, so those are a bunch of triangles. So upside down triangle, there's no such thing, right? Well, I don't know. Maybe in maths there isn't, but in history there might be. Some of you might know that, or some of you may know that. That is an upside down triangle, and it makes sense in history. It makes sense in terms of the Second World War and in terms of Nazi death camps to understand what a upside down triangle is. Whereas in math, that concept is incorrect. So in other words, an upside triangle, to understand that, whether that's a concept or a misconception, depends on the subject. Okay, so if you can capture that, you really have this idea that there is something called a subject, wherein this question makes sense and is a possibility, and where it doesn't make sense and is incorrect. Well, that frameworking is what I'm going to talk about as the disciplinary boundary, or what William talks about. What's it mean to know or do in your subject? And I would invite you to pause here and just write down, how is knowledge constructed in your subject? How important is the history of your subject to your subject? What are the figures and artifacts that are crucial? What are the activities and acts that are faithful to your discipline and which are not? So this is William talking about English, and I'm not really going to dispute it, but if a class is studying a Shakespeare play, then they watch a film and study one or two scenes, they may well teach students something about the play, and it may even increase their grades on the exam. But what's happening is not faithful to English literature. I think I'm going to agree. Yes, that isn't actually what it may be something that's preparing for the exam, but it's not the curriculum. It's not my subject. Dylan Wiliam is a math teacher, so he's much more rigorous and stronger in maths and science. So, and I'm not, so I'm going to have to read those out explicitly. But again, you might want to pause and think about, what is it? What is your subject? What is the domain? What is the vision of your subject? Here he goes. I'm going to have to read. Similarly, in mathematics, a teacher might define a prime number as a number that can be divided without remainder only by 1 in itself. Such a definition works pretty well most of the time, but actually creates the impression that 1 is prime, since it can be divided without remainder by 1 and itself. It turns out that it is important mathematically that 1 is not a prime number, for then any number can be expressed as the product of prime numbers in only one way, apart from the order of the numbers. A more rigorous definition of prime number is one with exactly 2 factors. Most numbers fail to be prime because they have too many factors, while 1 fails to be a prime because it has too few. The second definition is more faithful to the discipline of mathematics than the first. Okay, so what I understand about mathematics is that perhaps the first way might have been a trick, might have been a way to kind of facilitate a student getting through an exercise, but is not actually mathematical thinking. And that is a great example of the distinction between performance in an exam. Oh, who was it I was reading this? Daniel Craig talks about in America, where math teachers teach all these tricks for the math exam of memorizing kind of Pythagorean triplets. And they memorize these numbers instead of actually learning the calculations. And he says, okay, look, the first way can improve your performance potentially on an exam, but isn't actual learning. Here we have that idea too, that we need to understand what the definition of our actual discipline is to make sure it happens. So he says the word discipline is important because it connotes a subject and a commitment that is needed to acquire the ways of thinking in the subject. It's rigorous because it's the disciplinary habits of mind. It's coherent because it's the internal logic of the subject. So he gives this example. Okay, so this is the idea of what the subject is, that it's actually a thing that is rigorous and coherent and isn't random, certain habits of mind. Then he says that it's vertically integrated and there's a progression of thinking. So here he uses an example of light in the national curriculum, about the way our knowledge that light comes from different sources progresses all the way to the idea of velocity of light in different media. Okay, so this idea of progression of thinking is also crucial within your subject. And I'll take you back to this idea of solo, that within the disciplinary bounds, you have a model of progression that informs your direction of learning. This is now drawing it all together, that your curriculum itself should be able to articulate that progression. Now, specialists can understand sequencing. Now, sequencing is something that's very sexy and talked about. Ofsted's really picked it up. But I really want to challenge this, and I'm going to use Dylan Wiliam to do this. Okay, so he says, in the UK, mathematics teachers tend to teach the area of a triangle before teaching the area of a parallelogram. But in Japan, they do it the other way. So he says, if you're not interested, just skip. But he says, this is it. Two versions of the same triangle can always be fitted to give a parallelogram. But only when a triangle is a right-angled triangle can two versions of the triangle be fitted to make a rectangle. So, in fact, this sequencing is different in both countries. And there's a reason for it, okay? And he says careful sequencing of topics can lead to clearer connections between different topics, fewer things for students to remember, and make more effective learning, okay? Fair enough. But he says very few of these sequences are universal. So he goes on to say, look, some people say that you teach multiplication first, then division. And here he gives this very elaborate example for saying, well, actually, no, it could be the other way around. It all depends on your approach. So he says, and I'll just put a box around it because I'm running out of time. In a computational approach to multiplication and division, multiplication should precede division. But in a conceptual approach, it may make more sense to start with division. So look, sequence matters. It matters a lot, and it's really, you got to give it careful thought. But the problem is, the person checking your sequencing has to be an expert. And what they can do is, look at those two examples. They're very complex. If we talk about sequencing, we can have a professional dialogue, okay? But as an area of judgment for Ofsted, it's hopeless. It's utterly, utterly hopeless. And I witnessed it with going through the process with someone who's trying to scrutinize the sequencing in English. It is not at all a universal or acceptable process. It is one that is looking for internal justification. And what I'm going to push to you really is ditch sequencing, except for experts, move to a notion of progress, because progression is something that is a much more helpful subject. You could pause. You should think about this. I'm going to push you on this and force you to think about sequencing versus progression. I brought it up quite a lot. Okay, moving on. Williams also talks about the general critique is, look, the curriculum's too full. And he says, okay, this is a brutal process because it's so full and there's nothing to get rid of because it's all good. And, he says this about teaching too, which he's like, look, everything that teachers do is good, but some things evidence suggests are better than others. And so since we don't have any more time, we have to stop doing some things and start doing more of other things if we're going to improve learning. He's not going to dispute the fact that, look, all of it's important. Okay, that's true. But what can you do? You can't teach everything all day. So you're going to have to figure out different ways of ordering. And so he has one idea, which is ordering things in terms of big ideas. So these are his big ideas of science, these 10 big ideas. And this becomes a kind of overarching theme for the curriculum. Or then he simplifies it further into big ideas about science. Science assumes that for every effect, there is one or more causes. Scientific explanations, theories, and models are those that best fit the facts known at the time. The knowledge produced by science is used in some technologies to create products. Applications have ethical, social, economic, and political implications, okay? Look, he says you can argue with him about what should be included or not, but what they do provide you is a structure for the organization of this gargantuan domain of knowledge, your curriculum. Topics and activities are then selected only if they contribute to the developing students' understanding of these big ideas. Such a set of big ideas enables teachers, he argues, and students to see the connectedness of the whole curriculum, trunk and branches, if you will, rather than disorganized collection of twigs and pine needles. This is a really interesting approach for me because what I'm comfortable with is the idea of the vision of the subject. And I'm comfortable with the idea of the habits of mind and the large domain knowledge for English. But I haven't been able to kind of further locate the curriculum in these pillared thought. And it's a really interesting idea. I mean, for scientists, this is a very well-known model, and I would encourage you to think about it and play with it. For us in our own disciplines, I think we have to find our own, but it's a great idea to help organize this notion of the curriculum being too big. It is too big, so we're going to have to figure out a way of carving it up. He also adds, just concludes this section by saying, big ideas need not always be stated as outcomes, they can be experiences too. And I celebrate him for really pushing this example from the Scottish curriculum and the arts. Through dance, learners have rich opportunities to be creative and to experience inspiration and enjoyment. Creating and performing will be the core activities for all learners, and taking part in dance contributes to their physical education and physical activity. Learners develop their technical skills and the quality of their movement, and use their imagination and skills to create and choreograph dance sequences. They further develop their knowledge and understanding and their capacity to enjoy dance through evaluating performances and commenting on their work and the work of others. That's amazing, isn't it? That not everything we do has to be outcome stated. And again, English, science, or math. That there are things that are experiences, and part of what we're doing in the curriculum is balancing between outcomes and experiences. I think, again, another provocation. He ends this document by saying the curriculum is not something you come back to once in a while and try to rejig. That it's something that we're constantly, regularly improving and renewing all the time. And that it's a collaborative, collegial, and crucially a professional act of subject specialists that we are the ones that are determining our curriculum. And again, that's why that sequencing issue is a very important one for people who are specialists and understand what they're doing. And for the most part, those people who come in externally to scrutinize what you're doing don't. But what they're looking to do is catch you out in the oral articulation of what you're doing. And better for you that you are prepared to conceptualize and understand what you're doing in your curriculum as a large domain of knowledge and not a specific exam. Better that you can think about the progression within the term, the key stage, the year, the curriculum as a whole, and don't get caught up in their discourse and in their evaluative inadequate evaluative mechanisms. We are professionals, and since we're professionals, it is our job to understand and be as strong as we can. Okay, so now I've added curriculum to my my map of everything that I want to see and to be able to discuss with a teacher when I see them in a lesson. And what I want you to think about is this as a model versus Ofsted's slightly disgusting phrasing as far as the deep dive. I've been deep dived, and it was a hilarious experience. What I'm looking for is for the department, the department, the teacher articulation of what's going on, the student articulation and interpretation of what they're learning. I would like professionals to be in critical conversation, better, Jim Knight's idea, the better conversations where we are talking about what we're seeing in a way that helps us improve. And here we have a definition of what we're looking for. So we have something to push against, to engage with and discuss. And what William talks about in another book is this idea of supportive accountability, and how support and accountability are two sides of the same coin. Because what we're doing as leaders, as teachers, as colleagues, is we're ensuring that everyone meets the standard, okay? Everyone meets the standard there on the right. And that we all ensure we're doing that, and that we're all ensuring that we're supported to do so. And that we engage in a common language and vocabulary and criticality towards one another that leads us in a non-ego-based way to give feedback towards one another, towards improvement. And our job is to support everyone to achieve the things that we want achieved. So, this document, I've bounced around it. I've tried to stay focused on it itself. And I would invite you to read it too. I'll send across a copy. I just want to end with telling you what it is I think the next steps would be. That I really want you to think about the real curriculum is a creative act of professionals of what you're doing every day when we're in school. And that that what we need to start doing is separating learning, genuine learning, from exam performance, and to think about those things. They interact, of course, but to kind of prioritize the learning over the performance. To do that, to get that core vision as individuals, as departments, of that vision and passion of what we're doing in our subject, and to articulate that all the time. And this is something I think I need to really think about, is think about our key questions that our curriculum's trying to do. Look, think about sequence if you're a professional, of course, but don't let it take you over. Think about progression. And I would really invite you to go deeper in, if you're going to deep dive into SOLO as a progression model, because it's a much better way of helping you think about organizing your curriculum progression as opposed to sequencing. And of course, end with this, okay? Pedagogy trumps curriculum. So by all means, think through your curriculum all day. Work on it, improve it, because that's what we do. We are amazing teachers. We're intellects. We're professionals. We are working always to create situational interest, to get kids interested in things. And it's so hard at a distance. It's so hard at a distance for me to convey to you my passion for this and how important this all is if you're not in the room with me. This is a horrible proxy for that. And, you know, my students, what are they learning online? Very little, I'm going to argue. Okay. And I have no way of checking. So, well, I have some way, but, you know, engage. But when I'm in the room, when our pedagogy is, when my teaching is present and I am using all the techniques of creating structure to my lessons, talk partners, randomization, checking, creating moments, introducing concepts, bringing my passion to what I'm doing, that is my pedagogy. That is my teaching. That is who I am in the classroom. And that trumps all of this, okay? And that is the thing that if you work on, and we can all improve on, that will always improve the learning. So they're parallel conversations. There is an overlap. But I'm definitely of the mentality, and that's why these podcasts exist, that pedagogy trumps curriculum every day of the week. So next time we're going to think about assessment, assessing assessment literacy, and the other alternative topic would be putting the assessment in formative assessment. I'm thinking about that now. I hope that you're all doing well. We're so many weeks into this is unbelievable. I hope you're all staying safe. I hope that I provoked you and got you to think about things, and I hope to talk to you soon.